Welcome to Ohio Roots, the official podcast of the Ohio Genealogical Society. Join us as we embark on a captivating journey through Ohio's rich genealogy, history, and abundant resources. Hosted by me, OGS Executive Director Noel Poirier, this podcast brings you insightful conversations with a diverse array of guests, from OGS members, chapter leaders, and staff to renowned genealogists, historians, and influential figures within the genealogical community. Each episode delves into fascinating topics and captivating stories. So grab your headphones, hit that play button, and join us on this enthralling journey of Ohio's roots. Today on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast, we're joined by Paul Zuros. He's a passionate public historian with deep roots in the Ohio Valley. He was born and raised in Weirton, West Virginia. Paul's love for local history began early and led him to a career working with some of the region's most respected historical institutions. He's now the executive director of historic Fort Steuben in Steubenville, Ohio, and he's here today to share the fascinating story of the fort, its role in American history and Ohio history, and why it remains such an important site today. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Paul Zuros. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining me today for the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. I really appreciate you taking some time out of what I imagine is a very busy day.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Appreciate it. I want to start with something I ask kind of all of our guests, which is, those of us who get involved in history or genealogy or museums, in your case as well, there's something that kind of initiates that kind of spark to do that and pursue that. What was it that got you so interested in pursuing the career you've pursued?
Yeah, so I love history. I absolutely love it. And probably, it's growing up with parents who are really interested in history too. My dad and mother, they would take us on vacation every year. And one place we would always stop is Colonial Williamsburg. And I loved Williamsburg. We'd go to the Outer Banks for vacation and we'd stop there and spend a couple of days because we had some family in the region there. And I just loved it. I just absolutely loved it. And, I was soaking up all I could about Williamsburg. And then, as I got older, I realized, what was going on in my area where I grew up, what's happening here. So it sparked an interest in local history for me and, got me really into our history. So, that was probably my foray into local history and things like that. So, it was just having people who really cared and thought it was important to visit these sites,
Did you grow up around Steubenville?
Yeah, actually, I grew up just right across the river in Weirton, West Virginia. So okay. In the northern Panhandle, West Virginia. So we're the northern Panhandle there is about only 3 miles wide. So between Pennsylvania and Ohio. So here in Steubenville, it's like it's all home to me. It's all one big area, one home for me. Yeah.
So for folks who aren't familiar with the history of Fort Steuben, could you give us kind of the TED Talk on how Fort Steuben came to be?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, Fort Steuben is a really cool place. It's really a fort that was only occupied for about eight months or so in its history. So basically, to talk about historic Fort Steuben, you have to go back to the Revolutionary War. So when the Revolutionary War ends, the United States has a huge debt. They've got a lot of war debts they have to pay. They have to pay money to France. They have to pay, money to their soldiers who had fought for them. And one of the problems with the form of government that we were working under at that particular moment in history, of course, that was Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, among other things, did not allow the federal government to tax, its people. It was just not written in the government. So, the United States was looking for ways to raise money for the federal coffers. So one of the advantages that we had here in the United States at that particular time was that when the Treaty of Paris happened to end the Revolutionary War, the land west of the Ohio River was basically ceded over to the United States. And at one time, this land out here we call the Northwest Territory, roughly about 5 states come out of this Northwest Territory: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. This land, was ceded over to the United States. It had originally been part of the original 13 colonies, right? They had laid claim to some of this land, but the states gave up their claim. So there's this huge, vast amount of land out here in the West. And the idea was to go out and survey this Northwest Territory, break it up into manageable parts and sell it, being federal land as a way to make money for the United States government. So in 1785, they send a group of surveyors out here, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the background to make all this possible. But what happens is they open up this land. In 1785, a group of surveyors come out, supposed to have a surveyor represented from each state at that time. They left Pittsburgh, and they're going to go out and they're going to start this survey, and it was called the Seven Ranges. It's the first 7 ranges of the Northwest Territory. And so they go out and they start to survey, and they run this line called the geographer's line from what they call the point of beginning, which is a point just north of East Liverpool, Ohio. And it's going to run, and that's actually what they call the point of beginning because it's the beginning of all the land surveys west of the Ohio River. And it's a really cool thing that they did there. It's a historic site that is not really very much talked about, its importance, in the federal land system and all that stuff. But anyhow, so they start this survey, and when they get out here, these surveyors discover that there are Native Americans out here that are hostile to what they're doing out here, right? So there was a treaty signed just previous to that moment at Fort McIntosh. And so the powers that be said, you guys aren't going to have any problems out there in the West. You can go ahead with your business and survey. But there were some tribes out here that didn't recognize those treaties. Right. So the surveyors went back to Pittsburgh and they said, hey, we're not going to go out there again unless we have some kind of military escort. So what happens is that another provision in the Articles of Confederation was that the United States would not have a standing army. Well, that had to change pretty quickly. And so they passed this law to create what they call the First American Regiment under Josiah Harmer. And so Josiah Harmer creates this regiment, and he sends 3 companies of the First American Regiment with the surveyors the next year to go out and work on this survey. So as they're out there, working and surveying, and of course the Army is protecting the surveyors out here, they needed a winter camp when October came. The weather was turning pretty foul at that particular time. And so they decided to build historic Fort Steuben, of course not historic then, but Fort Steuben, as their winter camp, and where they would have sort of their headquarters when they're doing this surveying in the Northwest Territory. And so the fort existed for about 8 months, and by May of 1787, the survey, in this part is pretty much complete, the first 7 ranges. So what happens is the fort is abandoned. And the Army moves on. They go to Point South, and basically that's the end of the story of historic Fort Steuben, as a historic military camp. Yeah.
So how did the museum then come about?
Yeah. So there was a lot of discussion about rebuilding Fort Steuben. One of the questions we receive a lot here at the museum is, what happened after the Army leaves in 1787? And we don't really know. There was a contingent in the 1890s of the German population here in Steubenville. Let me just back up just a little bit. Fort Steuben always appeared in local lore and local history. So, the people of Steubenville always sort of knew that the fort existed. They knew where the block, which block the fort was at. The city of Steubenville was laid out in 1797. So not very long after, about 10 years after the fort sort of disappeared, right? So the soldiers left the fort. And I must mention, Fort Steuben, of course, is named after Baron von Steuben. And Baron von Steuben was never here. He never visited Steubenville or the fort, but it was named by the officers here in charge because they had served under the Baron in the Revolutionary War. Almost all the officers here were American Revolutionary War veterans. So they named the fort in honor of Baron von Steuben. And that's why, of course, Steubenville gets its name from the fort. So fast forward to when all this land that they're surveying and measuring is offered for sale, 1797, two guys buy all this land. Their names are Basilio Wells, who looms pretty heavy in Ohio history because I think he founds Canton, I believe, later on. He was a surveyor as well. And another fellow by the name of James Ross, who was a Pittsburgh lawyer and, saw this as a business venture, laying out the town of Steubenville. So they lay out all the streets in 1797, and they knew where the fort was, which block the fort was. And that sort of stayed in the public's mind, throughout all the years, going on into the future. So there were several attempts over the history to rebuild the fort. There was a big push actually in the 1850s to see if they could do it with several local guys here in town, and that's a really cool story, which I'll get into if you'd like. But they did some archaeological digs in the 1850s and 60s to learn more about the fort. They did find some artifacts in the ground from the time of the fort, but of course they were not successful in rebuilding the fort. So then in the 1890s, well, actually I think maybe the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was, of course, a larger German population in Steubenville, a lot of German immigrants, and they were super excited about Fort Steuben because, hey, it's named after one of their guys, Baron von Steuben, right, Prussian general. So they were super excited about that, and they started to do a lot of commemoration events here in town, and one of those was called the Steuben Fire in 1890, where they commemorated the burning of Fort Steuben after the soldiers left. So that was one of those things, like what happened to the fort? That was one of those things that people were saying because of this event that happened in the 1890s. Well, fast forward to the 1970s, they started to do some really serious archaeology here on the site from Franciscan University. And at this time in history, in downtown Steubenville, a lot of the buildings that were on this block were gone. There was a railroad siding here. It was a lot of parking lots, not like it was like in the 1890s and points in the past where it was a thriving business district. So that really prevented these guys from rebuilding the fort because, hey, to get an entire block in downtown Steubenville at this time in history would have been very, very difficult. So, by the 70s, everything's pretty much, gone from the block. And so they're doing archaeology, and they start archaeology here in 1978, and they don't discover in the archaeological record, any evidence that the fort burned down. So, So my opinion is that probably the fort, after the soldiers left, was used as a quarry for people coming in and out of this area, taking logs, taking buildings apart, moving them around. That's probably what I think mostly happened to the fort. But anyway, like I said, they started the archaeology in 1978, and the head archaeologist here, a fellow by the name of Jack Boyd, gave a presentation in 1986 to a group of university women from Franciscan University. And there was two ladies there in the audience that were just inspired to, what would it take to rebuild the fort? And as I mentioned, there was a couple pushes in history to do this, and they were never successful. And these two ladies, by just being in the right time and place and situation, were able to get this thing off the ground. They established the Old Fort Steuben Project as a nonprofit, and in 1989, the first buildings went up for the reconstruction of historic Fort Steuben. And it took us 20 years to completely rebuild the fort as you see it today. So it's a really cool story. It's a great success story of how, a block in a downtown can be turned into a park and a historic site and a visitor center. So it's really cool.
Hi everyone, Noel Poirier here, Executive Director of the Ohio Genealogical Society and your host for the Ohio Roots podcast. Did you know you can help preserve the past and empower the future? Your donation to the Ohio Genealogical Society helps protect vital family history records and supports research for generations to come. Visit www.ogs.org/donate and give today. Thank you so much for your support. If you enjoy listening to the Ohio Roots podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could go to whatever platform it is that you listen and give us a good review. Reviews help us get more listeners and reach more people with Ohio Roots and what we're trying to do with the Ohio Genealogical Society. So please leave us a nice review, and thanks for listening. Yeah, I mean, it's inspiring, really. You know, a lot of communities could probably learn a lot from that process. When someone visits Fort Steuben today, the museum, what are they going to experience? What's there for them to see?
Yeah, so when they come here at the fort, you know, we've got our visitor center here, and there's a lot of things that we do in addition to the fort. You know, we've got, of course, that fort. We've got our visitor center that was actually built using funds for the Ohio River Scenic Byway. So Route 7 is the Ohio River Scenic Byway. It stretches from Marietta to Cincinnati, or excuse me, East Liverpool to Cincinnati. And so we are technically the headquarters for the byway from East Liverpool to Marietta. And so that's an attraction. We are also on the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. We are one of the sister sites or headquarters for this region for that. So we have a National Park Service stamp here. So when people come to visit us here at the Visitor Center, they can get their National Park Service stamp, their passport book stamped. They could do a Junior Ranger program here at the fort, learn about the Lewis and Clark story. We've got exhibit spaces here for visitors to come and learn about, you know, the story of the fort. Also, we have a large Native American projectile point collection from a local fellow who found a lot of these, you know, projectile points on his property, and it's really fascinating. They've been studied through the universities and things, so it's a really top-notch collection here, and so people can see that. And then they can go out and visit the reconstruction of the fort. So the fort is almost identical and, you know, to what it was when the soldiers were here at that particular time in history. We were really lucky because the reconstruction is, we're fairly confident that it is pretty accurate of, you know, what it looked like. You know, for an obscure fort that was only here for 8 months, we know a lot of information about it. And that is because in 1787, in February of 1787, the fort was completed. And there was a fellow who came here by the name of Eureks Beatty, and he was the paymaster general for the United States Army at that particular time in history. Well, Beatty had a map made of the fort, a diagram showing, you know, how big the fort was, where the buildings were, what they were used for, how they were, you know, subdivided, some of them. And that map stayed in his family's collection until the 1850s, when his son, a fellow by the name of Charles Wilson Beatty, came to Steubenville as a Presbyterian minister. And he was interested in the history of the fort, and he remembered his father talking about visiting here when he was in the Army. And he found he went through his father's papers and found the original copy of the plan of Fort Steuben. So it was kind of a really cool serendipitous event where, you know, this map appears. And so that is what we based the reconstruction on. So when visitors come here, they're going to see a pretty accurate portrayal of what the fort looked like at this time period. And another place they could visit here as part of our site is the First Federal Land Office. And it's cool because that's like the next part of our story. So after they finished with the survey, you know, the land was ready to be sold. And so what the federal government does in that time is create land offices. And they created 5 land offices, you know, in the region here. And Steubenville was the very first land office, and we have the original building where people can come and see, you know, where, you know, folks would come and purchase land out in the Seven Ranges. So it's a cool place.
You mentioned your affinity for Colonial Williamsburg, and full disclosure,
Yes.
I worked there for 15 years.
All right.
So I want to ask you, do you do a lot of living history programming at the fort?
We try, yeah. We do. We usually have 2 events every year. We do a Fort Festival, and that's in June, where, you know, we have a lot of living history guys come down, and we have tomahawk throwing. We have a surveyors that come and show people how land was surveyed at that time in history. We have a group called the 8th Pennsylvania. They come down and show, our visitors what life was like for a soldier. I mean, so yeah, we do some of that. And then we have, usually in September, we do some kind of event with a group called the Brigade of the American Revolution. It's another, living history event. They come down and they do a fabulous job. So, we try to show, visitors what life was like here on the frontier. And it was pretty tough. Life was tough out here.
You mentioned a little bit about the indigenous people who were here before Fort and the surveying. Is there an effort at the fort to discuss that complicated story?
It is a very complicated story. It is a very complicated story. We do our best to try to explain that story when visitors come in. We get a lot of questions about those particular topics, especially what were the tribes here, and with anything in history, it's a very complicated story. So to start that discussion, you have to reach way back and start from the beginning, and so it's hard. But we realize, at this time in history, there's a lot of conflict on both sides of the aisle. So, we do our best to explain that history. And, the fort was built to settle this area, to open it up for settlement from the United States. And so, that's and like I mentioned, historically, there were some tribes in the area that were all for it. They signed the treaty at Fort McIntosh. They were ready to go. And then there were some tribes that weren't, that did not follow that treaty. So, and of course, the whole reason of the fort is for, the surveyors to be protected from military contingent. So we get a lot of questions. Was the fort ever attacked? Was there any battles here? No, there was no battles here. This was a pretty substantial structure in the wilderness. So, it's pretty imposing out here when there's really, just the wilderness, and you see this huge fort structure. So that could be one of the reasons. And also it's in the winter, so there probably wasn't as much fighting in those winter camps as there was in, summer encampments and things.
So it's interesting to me, and for a fort that only existed for a fairly short amount of time, the impact its construction had on the settling of the Northwest Territory and ultimately, the American settlement of the West in general is very significant. So it's an important site. Right. If people are going to visit it, what are your hours? What are your operating hours? How do they get to you? Sure. Things like that.
Yeah. So we're located in downtown Steubenville, 120 South 3rd Street in Steubenville. We're open pretty much every day during the week, Monday through Friday, 10 to 4, Monday through Saturday, 10 to 4, and Sunday, 11 to 4. So people can come here. They can call ahead, visit our website, oldfortsteuben.com, and, learn about the site and call if you have any questions. There's a lot of stuff that we do here. Of course, we've got the fort. We've got our summer concert series, which happens, on Thursday nights here at the fort. So there's a lot happening here. So I hope visitors can come and enjoy the place. And usually when visitors come here, they're surprised because they're just amazed that, a place like this exists here in Steubenville. I have to admit that growing up just across the river, we never came over to Fort Steuben. And I remember coming over here the first time, I'm like, holy moly, this place exists. Like, this is so cool that this history is just right here. And being from, West Virginia, we didn't learn anything about Ohio history. We didn't learn about the importance of, the land survey and, the land office. The land office is such a cool place because we always tell people, look, this is the Ellis Island, we believe, of Ohio, because people are coming over here. Their first stop, as settlers, is the land office if they're willing to buy land out there. So a lot of people's stories start here at the land office in Ohio and points west. So and we do get a lot of people who come in looking for family histories and things like that, and they're looking for land records and things. Now the land office closed in 1840. So we don't have any records, from that time period. The building that was the land office existed as a land office from 1800 to 1840. After that, the building was encased in another building. It's a log building, right? So they encased the whole building in like an Italianate style structure. at the end of the Market Street Bridge here in town. And that's where it stayed until 1940, when they demolished that building and found the original logs from the land office. They knew that the land office was at that site because of the oral traditions and histories here, and we knew where the building ended up because it was moved a couple of times in its history. So they found that structure encased in this other structure, and in 1940 they were able to raise the money to get the building completely restored, and they moved it out to, on Sunset Boulevard here in Steubenville, where it stayed as a museum. Then it was moved down to the north end of town, where it became where it was still a museum, but then West Virginia built a bridge across the Ohio River, so then it had to be moved again. It was moved to our site. So it's still a museum, and it's really cool. But we do get a lot of people that come and ask for records, and I usually point them to the Bureau of Land Management, the federal website.
That was kind of my next question for you. If somebody's researching their family connection or any connection, or simply just interested in Fort Steuben, what kind of resources are out there for them to discover more?
Yeah. So the Bureau of Land Management is a huge one, because that is going to show you everybody who purchased land in Steubenville. And so when you would come to the land office to purchase land, and this is land, like I mentioned, any land that was sold in our region from 1800 to 1840. And that was a huge, I mean, there was just, I can't imagine how many thousands and thousands of people came through those doors of the land office. And, when they get there, they're buying land. And in the early days, the minimal purchase for land was 640 acres. That was the minimum that you could buy. And it was $1 an acre. And so that was a lot of money. And you couldn't pay with paper money. You had to pay with actual hard money, like gold, silver, British pound, that kind of stuff. Because the currency was just so devalued after the American Revolution. I'm talking the early days. So when you'd buy that land, you would get what they call a land patent, and it's a little different than a deed today that you might get if you buy a house. The land patent is the transfer from the federal government, from a governmental entity, to an individual, right? So this land patent was given, and up until 1833, all of those land patents had to be signed by the President of the United States. So if you find an early land patent before 1833 with a president's signature, it probably is the actual president's signature.
That's pretty neat. We have a nice collection of those in our archive, actually.
Yeah, they're so cool. And so people are, it's so neat when people come in and they show us maybe a picture of their land patents from their family. It's a neat thing. It's a cool thing. And then, the land office would issue that to you once they got it back from, the federal government, and you would have it in your family's collection there. But I'm always surprised because, if I would go there to buy land, like, I want to see it. I want to go out there. I want to see the land maybe that I'm buying. For $640 in 1800, that's a huge amount of money. Most of the time, these guys didn't have the opportunity to go out there and see their land. So one of the cool things that the surveyors did, in the 1780s, is they actually kept notes about each section and range and township. And there's a whole history, which we could talk about for 2 or 3 hours, on how they actually surveyed it, the range, section, township, and what all that meant. But one of the things that they did was they kept a journal about, what the land was like, right? So, was it a good grazing land? Was it good farming land? Or was the soil rocky? Or was there a creek running through this particular section of land? So, they gave some description of this land that, you could read when you were at the land office to give you an idea about what you were actually buying. And what's so cool about this whole process is that, over in Virginia, and in the east, just right across the river, the process that they were using to survey land was leaps and bounds, right? Meets and bounds. So it was different than this grid pattern that we create in Ohio, and it was a really incredible moment and land surveying and settlement in the west of this land survey.
We'll have to have you back to chat more about that.
I know, we can go on and on.
Yes, you can. Paul, I want to thank you for joining me today to talk to me about Fort Steuben, historic Fort Steuben, the museum, its history, its importance on the scale of what it meant to Ohio and to the Northwest Territory. Thank you so much for taking some time to be with me today, Paul. I appreciate it. I want to thank Paul for joining me today on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast to talk about the Fort Steuben Museum and everything that goes on there. It was fascinating to learn about the fort's history and how it came to be, all the attempts to kind of rebuild it and how that happened. It was great also to discuss the importance of the land office, which is located there in Steubenville as well, and how it affected the settlement of Ohio and many of our families who settled here. So again, I want to thank Paul Zuros for a wonderful conversation on today's OGS Ohio Roots podcast, and I want to thank you for listening. Curious about your family's Ohio past? The Ohio Genealogical Society is your gateway to uncovering generations of family history. Whether you're a seasoned researcher or just starting your journey, the OGS offers expert resources, local chapters, exclusive online records, online and in-person programs, and a passionate community ready to help you. Join today and bring your family story to life, because your family's history matters. Visit ogs.org to start your discoveries.
The Ohio Roots podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Genealogical Society, the premier gateway for discovering your Ohio family history. Hosted by OGS Executive Director Noel Poyer and edited by Luke Poyer. Theme song is Beautiful Ohio, recorded by Bob Stanley and his orchestra in 1944. To learn more about joining the Ohio Genealogical Society, visit www.ogs.org.